The heavy oak door of the study slammed shut. It rattled the antique glass in the windows. Richard stood by the fireplace. He adjusted his custom silk tie and smiled a tight, cold smile. Next to him, on the mahogany desk, sat the deed to my farm. It waited for my signature. I picked up the pen. My hand was shaking. Before the ink could touch the paper, a hand clamped over my wrist. The fingers were calloused, stained with engine grease, and warm. I looked up into Julian's dark eyes. "Don't sign it," Julian said. His voice was low. Richard laughed.
You let the hired help give you financial advice now?
Julian kept his eyes on me.
I am not a hired hand.
He said, "Let me tell you how I got into this ruin," holding a pen that would sign away the only home I ever knew. "My name is Elena. 3 months earlier, my life was dirt, sweat, and debt. My father died in the spring. He left me 100 acres of apple orchards in the valley. He also left me a massive mortgage. The bank sent letters every week. The tractors broke down. The irrigation pipes leaked. I was drowning. Therefore, I needed help. I put a sign out on the county road. That was how I met Julian. He walked up the dirt driveway on a Tuesday. He wore a faded canvas jacket and heavy work boots. His hair was dark and a little too long. I asked for his resume. He held up his hands. "I know engines," Julian said.
I know soil. I work hard and I keep my mouth shut.
I hired him on the spot. I couldn't afford to pay him much, but I offered him the small guest cabin out by the barn. Julian went to work. He fixed the old diesel tractor in 2 days. He cleared the dead wood from the north orchard. He didn't talk much. Sometimes I watched him from the kitchen window while I washed the dishes. I watched the way his shoulders moved under his shirt when he swung an axe. I noticed him. I told myself to stop. He worked for me. I had too many problems to think about romance. My biggest problem was Richard Sterling. Richard owned the Sterling estate. It was a massive property right next to mine. He had old money. He drove a black sports car that cost more than my entire house. Richard wanted my land. He wanted to expand his private golf course. My orchards were in the way. At first, he made polite offers. Then he started showing up at my front door with expensive wine and flowers. "Elena," Richard said one evening. He sat on my worn-out porch swing. He wore a gray suit that looked out of place against my peeling paint.
You are fighting a losing battle. Let me take this burden away. Sell to me, or better yet, marry me. We can combine the properties. You will never have to worry about a broken water pump again.
He reached over and touched my knee. His fingers felt cold. I pulled away. "The farm isn't a burden," I told him. "It is my home." But things kept going wrong. The next morning, I woke up to a flooded field. The main irrigation line burst in the night. It washed out a whole row of young trees. I stood in the mud. I stared at the ruin. The bank payment was due in 2 weeks. This was going to cost thousands to fix. Julian waded through the water and stood next to me. He knelt in the mud. He ran his fingers over the broken plastic pipe. He didn't say it was bad luck. He pulled a heavy pocket knife from his jeans. He cut away a section of the pipe.
This didn't burst under pressure,
Julian said. He handed me the piece.
Look at the edges. It was cut. Someone took a hacksaw to this.
My throat went dry. I couldn't swallow. I looked around the empty fields. Who would do that? Julian wiped the mud on his jeans. He looked up the hill toward the massive iron gates of the Sterling estate. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. That should have been the end of Richard's polite visits. It wasn't. We spent the next week working side by side from sunrise to midnight. We had to fix the pipes and save the trees before the rot set in. One night, A heavy rainstorm rolled through the valley. We were stuck in the main barn. We tried to rebuild the pump motor. The power was out. We worked by the yellow light of a camping lantern. I handed Julian a wrench. My fingers brushed his. He didn't pull away. He looked up at me. There was mud on his cheek. I reached out and wiped it away with my thumb. His skin was warm. The rain hammered against the tin roof of the barn.
You should go inside.
Julian said softly.
You are freezing. I am not leaving you to do this alone.
I said. He set the wrench down. He stepped closer. He smelled like rain and motor oil. He reached up and touched the side of my neck. His thumb traced my jawline. My breath caught in my throat. He leaned in and kissed me. It was slow and deliberate. I closed my eyes and pulled him closer. I twisted my hands into his canvas jacket. For one moment, I didn't care about the bank or Richard or the dying trees. I wanted to stay right there. But the real world doesn't go away because you close your eyes. The next morning, I went to the guest cabin to bring Julian some coffee. The door was open. He wasn't there. I walked in to set the mug on the small table. That was when I saw it. Underneath a pile of work shirts, a sleek silver laptop was open. The screen was glowing. On the screen was a detailed topographical map of my farm. Next to the laptop was a thick folder. It had a familiar logo printed on it, Sterling Enterprises. My hands froze. The mug slipped from my fingers. It shattered on the wooden floor. Hot coffee splashed onto my boots. Julian walked into the cabin. A second later, he held a bundle of firewood. He saw the broken mug. He saw me looking at the folder. He dropped the wood. Elena, Julian said. He took a step toward me. Don't, I said. My voice sounded thin. I pointed at the folder. You work for him. You are Richard's spy.
It is not what you think.
Julian said. He held his hands up. He paid you to cut the pipes. I said. My chest felt tight. I couldn't pull in a full breath. He paid you to ruin my trees, so I would be desperate enough to sell. And last night was a distraction. No, Julian said sharply. His voice was hard.
Last night was real. I didn't cut your pipes. Richard's men did. I know, because I have been tracking them for 6 months.
I crossed my arms. I didn't want to hear another lie. Explain it, Julian, right now. He let out a long breath. He ran a hand through his hair.
My real name is Julian Vance. 2 years ago, I owned a clean energy startup in the city. I designed a new water filtration system. Richard Sterling was my main investor. He forced a hostile takeover. He stole my patents and pushed me out of my own company.
I stared at him. So what are you doing in my barn?
Richard has a pattern.
Julian said. He walked over to the laptop. He turned the screen toward me. It was full of banking records and property deeds.
He finds vulnerable land. He sabotages the owners. Then he buys the land for pennies. He uses dummy corporations to hide his tracks. I followed his trail for a year. I needed proof, hard proof that he orders the sabotage. I saw he was targeting your farm. I got a job here to catch him in the act.
I stood there. He wasn't a spy. He was hunting Richard. But he still lied to me from the day we met. If someone lies to you to protect you, is it still a betrayal? Would you have forgiven him on the spot?
You should have told me.
I said, if I told you, you would have looked at him differently. Julian said.
He would have known we were onto him. We need him to make a mistake. He is not making mistakes.
I said bitterly, he is winning. The bank called this morning. They foreclose at the end of the month. I have nothing left. I walked out of the cabin. I didn't look back. I spent the whole day walking through the orchards. I looked at the trees my father planted. I had failed. By the time the sun went down, I made my decision. I drove to Richard's estate. Richard answered the door himself. He looked at my dirty boots on his marble floor and smiled. He knew why I was there. I will sell, I told him. But I want a fair price. Enough to clear the debt.
Of course, my dear.
Richard said smoothly.
Come back tomorrow afternoon. I will have the contract ready. We can celebrate.
I drove back to the farm. Julian was waiting on my porch. The porch light cast long shadows across his face.
You went to see him.
Julian said. I surrendered, I said. My arms felt heavy. It is over. Julian walked down the steps. He stood in front of me.
It is not over.
He said, Richard keeps a private ledger in his study. It tracks cash payments to his fixers, the guys who cut your pipes. I saw it through his window 3 nights ago. If we get that ledger, we can prove fraud. The state will freeze his assets. The sale will be blocked. I shook my head.
He has security cameras everywhere. I know how to bypass them.
Julian said.
But I can't get into the study. He keeps it locked. I am going to his study tomorrow.
I said, slowly, to sign the contract. Julian looked at me. The silence stretched between us.
You would have to leave the door unlocked.
He said.
And you would have to keep him distracted.
It is a huge risk, I said.
I am sorry. I lied to you, Elena.
Julian said softly. He reached out and took my hand. His grip was firm.
Let me help you fight him.
I squeezed his hand back. We do it tomorrow. Therefore, that brings us back to the study, back to the heavy oak door. I wore my best dress. Richard poured the whiskey. The contract sat on the desk. When I walked into the room, I made sure the door didn't latch completely. I left it cracked by ½ inch. Richard didn't notice. He was busy talking about how much money he was going to make, turning my father's land into a country club. Sign right here, Richard said. He tapped the bottom line. I picked up the pen. I stalled. I asked questions about the payment schedule. I asked about the bank transfer. I needed to give Julian time to slip through the side entrance and find the ledger in the filing cabinets behind us. The study door banged open. The wind must have caught it. Richard spun around. Julian stood in the doorway. He was out of breath. His jacket was torn. He held a thick black leather book, the ledger. Richard dropped his glass. It shattered on the carpet.
Who the hell let you in here?
He yelled. He looked at me, then back at Julian.
Get the security guards.
They are busy, Julian said.
I locked them in the pool house.
Richard's face turned red. He lunged for the desk drawer. Julian was faster. He crossed the room and shoved Richard hard against the bookshelf. Books crashed to the floor. That was when Julian grabbed my wrist to stop me from signing the paper.
I am not a hired hand,
he said. Richard stared at him. Recognition dawned in his eyes. Vance, he whispered. Me, Julian said. He held up the black ledger.
I have the payment logs, Richard. I have the receipts you paid to the men who destroyed Elena's pipes. I already sent photos of the pages to my lawyer in the city. The police are on their way.
Richard panicked. He tried to grab the book. Julian pushed him back. Richard stumbled and fell onto the ruined carpet. He sat surrounded by broken glass and spilled whiskey. All his money and expensive suits couldn't hide what he was, a thief.
You are done, Richard,
I said. I picked up the contract from the desk. I tore it in half. I dropped the pieces onto his chest.
Stay away from my farm.
We walked out of the house together. We didn't stop walking until we were back on the dirt road leading to my property. The police sirens started wailing in the distance. They headed up the hill toward the Sterling estate. Julian stopped and looked at me. The adrenaline faded. We stood in the quiet night air. So, Julian Vance, corporate tech genius. He rubbed the back of his neck.
Former genius, current farmhand, if you will still have me.
I can't afford you, I said. He stepped closer. He reached out and pulled me against him.
I work for cheap,
He said.
and I am good at fixing tractors.
He kissed me again. There was no rain, no cold, no fear of losing everything. It was warmth and dirt and the smell of the apple orchards around us. We saved the farm. Richard went to prison for fraud and extortion. The state seized his assets to pay restitution. I got a check large enough to clear the mortgage and buy a new irrigation system. Julian stayed. He built a new life with me, right there in the dirt. But a month later, I found a second silver laptop hidden under the floorboards of the guest cabin. It wasn't tracking Richard Sterling. It was tracking my bank accounts.